As a result of the Russian victory and our lack of any reserves over East Prussia, the province immediately adjacent to the collapsed front was in grave danger. Therefore, I, as head of the training units of the armoured forces, ordered on July 17, 1944, the transfer of all combat-ready formations from Wunsdorf and Krampnitz to East Prussia in the fortified area of Lotzen. On the afternoon of July 18th, an Air Force general I knew came to me and said that he would like to talk to me. He told me that the new commander of the troops in the West Field, Marshal von Kluge, intends to conclude an armistice with the Western powers without Hitler's knowledge, for which he wants to soon enter into negotiations with the enemy. This news completely stunned me. In my imagination immediately began to draw events that were to affect the weakened Eastern Front and detrimentally affect the entire fate of Germany. This move by Kluge would at once lead to the collapse of our defences both in the West and in the East, and to the relentless advance of the Russians. Until that moment, I could not have imagined that a German general fighting the enemy could come to such a decision against the will of the head of state. I could not believe this report, so I asked my interlocutor from what sources he had learned about it. The general refused to answer this question. Nor did he tell me the reasons that prompted him to make such a startling announcement to me, or what he was doing it for. To my question whether the intended step would be taken in the near future, he answered in the negative. Consequently, I had the time necessary to calmly contemplate this strange message. Since I had no conditions for calm reflection in the headquarters because of the continuous reports and visits, I decided on July 19th to go to Allenstein, Torre and Hohensalz for the purpose of inspection and to make a definite decision during the trip. To report everything I had heard to Hitler without knowing the source of the message, I would have quite unjustly brought on Field Marshal von Kluge a heavy, unfounded suspicion. This would have led to bad consequences for Mr. von Kluge and also for the Western Front. On the other hand, if I had concealed this report and it later turned out to be correct, this would also have had severe consequences for me. Consequently, it was very difficult to find the right way out of the situation. On the morning of July 19th, I was inspecting anti-tank units in Allenstein. I was suddenly summoned to the telephone. My Chief of Staff, General Termail, asked me to suspend for 3 days the order to transfer from Berlin to East Prussia armoured training units. General Olbricht, Chief of General Affairs of the Land Forces in Berlin, called him and asked him to do so, because tomorrow, i.e. July 20th, 1944, in the suburbs of Berlin will be held manoeuvres of reserve and training units under the code name Valkyrie. These manoeuvres may be disrupted if the armoured training units do not take part in them. The code word Valkyrie served to disguise manoeuvres to repel enemy airborne attacks, and to contain domestic unrest at least. That was the only meaning I knew of. When Termail reassured me with the latest reports from the East Prussian frontier and assured me that it would be possible to delay the dispatch for 2 or 3 days, I consented, though with great reluctance, to the participation of the training units in these manoeuvres. In the afternoon of that day, I inspected the reserve units at Thorn. On July 20th in the morning, I went to Hohensalz to inspect the anti-tank units there. I spent the evening at home in Depenhof. I went out for a walk in the field, but about 7 p.m. A motorcyclist came to pick me up and said that I was being summoned to the telephone. At home, I learned that I was being summoned to talk on the telephone by the Führer's main headquarters. Immediately, I was told that the radio had broadcast a report of an assassination attempt on Hitler. Only about midnight, I contacted by telephone with General Termail. He briefly told me about the assassination attempt, gave me the names of the conspirators, and informed me of Hitler's order that I should report to the Führer tomorrow and receive an appointment to the General Staff instead of Zeitzler. A special plane is to pick me up on July 21st at 8 o'clock at Hohensalz and take me to East Prussia. All other press reports about my activities on July 20th, 1944 are mere fabrications. I had no idea that an assassination attempt was being prepared. I did not speak to anyone about it. The only telephone conversation I had on July 20th took place at midnight with General Termail. The event which led to my appointment to the General Staff, as indicated in the statement of General Tamail in my possession, tantamount to an oath, occurred as follows. On July 20th, 1944, about 6 p.m., Lieutenant Colonel Weisenegger of General Weisenegger's Staff of Operational Command of the Armed Forces, Colonel General Adolf, telephoned General Tamail and inquired about me. Tamail indicated my location. He was then ordered to immediately arrive at the Führer's headquarters and report his arrival to Hitler. Tamail arrived there at about 7 p.m. Hitler received him in the presence of his adjutant Colonel von Beloff. He immediately asked where I was and whether I was in good health. Tamail replied. Then Hitler said that he had decided to appoint General Boulay Chief of General Staff, but in view of the fact that the latter was wounded during the assassination attempt, and it is not known how long he will be in recovery, Hitler decided instead of Boulay to entrust Colonel General Guderianu to conduct the affairs of the Chief of General Staff. Tamail was entrusted to take care that tomorrow morning I was able to arrive at Hitler. That's the way things were going. So, at first Hitler did not intend to appoint me to succeed Zeitzler, with whom he did not get along from a certain time. His choice fell on me only when the envisaged candidate for this little honourable position in connection with the assassination attempt on Hitler dropped out of the line. All conclusions drawn in the post-war period by Hitler's opponents from the fact of my appointment as Chief of the General Staff are untenable. They belong either to the realm of gossip or are malicious, slanderous fabrications. As a matter of fact, the rumour mongers themselves could have realised that in July 1944, it was not at all tempting to develop operations on the Eastern Front, and this is exactly what a person occupying such a high position should be engaged in. Of course, I have often been asked why I agreed to take up such a difficult position in the first place. The answer is simple: because I was ordered to. A description of further events will show that the Eastern Front was on the edge of the abyss, and that it was a question of saving millions of Germans, both soldiers and civilians. I would have been a scoundrel and a coward in my own eyes if I had given up trying to save the troops of the Eastern Front and my homeland, East Germany. And the fact that I finally failed to do so will remain until the last days of my life my misfortune and sorrow. Hardly anyone else can feel the bitterness of the fate of our East Germany and its innocent, honest, loyal and brave people more painfully than I do. I am Prussian myself. On July 21st, 1944, I flew from Hohensalz to Lützen. On arrival, I had a short conversation with Tamail, who told me about the progress of yesterday's meeting with Hitler and the assassination attempt on him. I then met with Field Marshal Keitel, Colonel General Jodl and General Bergdorf, the successor to Hitler's badly wounded Chief Adjutant Schmund and Chief of Staff of the Army. With them I had to coordinate some issues in connection with my appointment as Chief of the General Staff of the Army. First of all, discussed the issue of almost complete replacement of the officer staff of the General Staff of the Army. It was necessary to replace the previous officers because some of them had been wounded during the assassination attempt on Hitler, for example, the Chief of Operations, General Huesinger, and his first assistant, Colonel Brandt. Others were suspected of complicity with the conspirators and were therefore arrested. Others I considered by their past activities unsuitable, and the rest should be replaced for the reason that they had never seen the front. Even before the meeting began, I received orders to report at 4 p.m. to the office building of the General Command of the Land Forces to accept business. After finishing my discussions with the officers of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, I went about mid-afternoon to report to Hitler. He gave the impression of a very exhausted man. One ear was bleeding a little, his right hand hung motionless on the bandage. Receiving me, he kept calm. Hitler entrusted me with the conduct of affairs of the Chief of General Staff of the Army and said that he had not had close contact with my predecessor Zeitzler since certain times. Zeitzler, Hitler continued, had relinquished his position 5 times. Such requests should not be in time of war. He, Hitler, can no longer grant such rights to prominent generals as he does not grant them to soldiers at the front. Generals should not ask him for dismissal or resignation unless something special has happened to them. He forbade me to submit my resignation regardless of the pretext. The conversation then turned to my personal wishes. My request to staff the General Staff of the Army with officers I had selected was granted. The conversation also touched upon the highest command positions at the front. I noted that the new commander of the troops in the West does not have sufficient experience in the management of armoured formations, and that I am therefore forced to make a proposal to use him in another position. Suddenly it occurred to Hitler, by the way, he is a co-conspirator. All three Keitel, Jodl, and Bergdorf remarked that Field Marshal von Kluge was the best horse in the stable, and that therefore, although he was aware of the preparation of the plot, he could not be discarded. Thus, my attempt to discreetly remove Mr. von Kluge from the Western Front failed. Since Hitler was obviously better informed than I about the position of Field Marshal von Kluge, I refused to take any further steps in this direction. In discussing official affairs, Hitler made several remarks concerning my personality. He reported that my life might be in danger, and that he had therefore ordered the secret field police to guard me. The police also thoroughly checked my apartment and automobiles, but found nothing suspicious. For the first time in my life as a soldier, I decided to entrust the soldiers selected from the recovered tankers to guard my apartment and the headquarters office directly. They honestly performed their service until my retirement. From time to time they were replaced. Then Hitler, knowing of my heart condition, advised me to consult his personal physician Morel and take injections from him. I accepted this suggestion and soon appeared for a consultation, but on the advice of my Berlin physician I refused the injections suggested by Mr. Morel, since Hitler's treatment by Morel had been ineffective. In the assassination attempt, Hitler's right arm, eardrum and eustachian tube of the right ear were damaged. He recovered from this very quickly. His illness, which manifested itself in a continuous nervous twitching of the left arm and left leg, which is easily noticed by anyone who met with him, had nothing to do with the assassination attempt. Mental trauma. Hitler was stronger than the injury received. Inherent in his character, deeply rooted distrust of people in general, and the general staff and generals in particular, now turned into hatred. Due to his illness, which imperceptibly leads to a reassessment of moral concepts in the human psyche, rudeness turned into cruelty, a tendency to bluff in deceitfulness. He often spoke untruths without noticing it himself, and assumed in advance that people were deceiving him. He believed no one. Conversations, which before had been very difficult to conduct with him, now became a real torment. He often lost his temper and did not give himself credit for his expressions. In the narrow circle of his people, he has not met with objections since the polite and courteous Schmundt was replaced by a rough Bergdorf. After the conversation with Hitler, I took a quick look at the so-called operations room II, the place where yesterday's assassination attempt on Hitler, which was very often and much written about, and then went to the office building of the Chief of General Staff of the Army to his workplace. The room was empty. No one even greeted me. I went around all the rooms and finally came across a sleeping sergeant by the name of Riel. I sent this brave soldier to look for one of the officers. Soon he came with Major Baron Freytag von Loringhofen, whom I knew as a tank officer who had served as my commissioned officer in the tank army in 1941. I appointed Freytag as my adjutant. I then tried to contact the headquarters of the army groups to inquire about the situation on the fronts. In the office of the Chief of General Staff were 3 telephone sets, the purpose of which I was not quite clear. I picked up the telephone receiver. Some female voice answered. When I called my name, the girl shrieked and hung up. It took some time until finally I managed to calm down the communicator and establish the connection I needed. The situation at the front up to July 20th, 1944 is covered in the previous chapter. It was a terrific one. In order to correct it to any extent, it was necessary first of all to make the General Staff of the Land Forces workable. This chief organ in charge of the Eastern Front was disorganized. My predecessor had intended to move the General Staff of the Army to Maybachlager at Zossen near Berlin. A number of departments were already located there, the Quartermaster General with his departments, the chief of military transportation of the armed forces, and other important departments. The communications organs had for the most part already been transferred. From East Prussia, therefore, it was possible with great difficulty to keep in touch with the front and to take care of the supply of the army with everything necessary, which was the responsibility of the General Command of the Land Forces. The first thing I had to decide was to determine the location of the General Command of the Land Forces. Such a place I chose East Prussia, where Hitler and the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. The departments transferred to Zossen had to be returned immediately. The next activity to restore proper order was the staffing of the divisions of the headquarters. I invited General Wenck, who had been Chief of Staff to Schorner, to the post of Chief of Operations, and soon expanded his duties to the functions of Chief of Staff for the operational leadership of the land forces, subordinating to him, in addition to the operational department, the organizational department, and the department for the study of foreign armies of the East, so that the entire operational apparatus was in one hand. At the head of the operational department was placed Colonel von Bohnen, Organizational Department Lieutenant Colonel Wendland. Intelligence Department East was headed by an experienced intelligence officer, Colonel Galen. Colonel Tolpe became the Quartermaster General instead of General Wagner, who committed suicide. General Berlin, formerly my artillery advisor in France and Russia, was appointed Inspector General of Artillery at the General Command of the Army General Prawn. My old Chief of Communications in the campaigns of 1940 to 1941 became Chief of Communications of the Armed Forces. While these men came to me, while they were drawn into the work, a certain amount of time passed. Of the formerly prominent officers of the Army General Staff, only one Chief of Military Transportation of the Armed Forces, the able General Gerke, remained in his position. In the first weeks of my activity, I did my best to keep the entire staff in continuous operation. For the solution of other pressing questions, I had no time. The events, which to us now may seem very important, did not bother me at that time, because in the turmoil there was no opportunity to discuss matters not related to the front. To save the situation at the front, all my new colleagues and myself worked without knowing sleep or rest. What were the actual consequences of July 20th? The man whose life was attempted was lightly wounded. His physical condition, which was already not brilliant, deteriorated. His mental equilibrium was permanently disturbed. All the evil spirits that dwelt in his soul came out. His actions were in no way curbed. In order for Hitler's assassination to seriously affect the German government apparatus, it was necessary to eliminate the pillars of the National Socialist regime together with Hitler. But none of them were with Hitler at the time of the assassination attempt. The elimination of Himmler, Göring, Goebbels, Bormann, to name the most important, was not envisaged. The conspirators did not attempt to create the slightest guarantee for the realization of their political plans in case the assassination attempt succeeded. The assassin Count Stauffenberg was aware of this flaw in the plan a few days before the assassination attempt in Obersalzberg. He refrained from carrying out his intention, noting that in the hall was not Himmler and Göring, whose presence he had counted on. It is not known why Count Stauffenberg, knowing that there were no prerequisites for the complete political success of his move, decided to act on July 20th. Perhaps he was prompted to do so by the news of an existing order to arrest Dr. Goedeler. If the assassination attempt on Hitler had succeeded, the conspirators would have needed some troops to seize power. As it was, they didn't have a single company. They were not even able to take power in Berlin, where Count Stauffenberg flew from East Prussia, who received false news of the success of his assassination attempt. Officers and soldiers of the units assigned to participate in maneuvers Valkyrie had no idea of the plans of the conspirators. This explains their subsequent actions. My order to refrain from sending from Berlin training units of armored forces, given for completely different reasons, also could not contribute to their success, because the conspirators did not even dare to initiate the personnel of the units and their commanders in their plans. The foreign policy prerequisites for the success of the conspiracy were also absent. The connections of the conspirators with prominent political figures of our adversaries were weak. None of the prominent political figures of the enemy camp took any action to support the conspirators. It is hardly erroneous to suppose that the prospects of the German state, even if the assassination attempt had been successful, would have been no better than they are today. Our adversaries were thinking not only of eliminating Hitler and Nazism. The first victims of the assassination attempt were Colonel Brandt from the Operations Department of the General Staff of the Army, General Korten, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Schmundt, Hitler's Chief Adjutant, and stenographer Berger. Some employees of the Army High Command and the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces were wounded. These were unnecessary casualties. The next victims were those who aided or sympathized with the conspiracy along with their families. Only a small number of those executed actually took an active part in organizing the conspiracy. Most of them had only heard about it and paid the price in death for keeping silent about the rumors being spread and the conversations going on behind the scenes. The first ringleaders to fall by suicide were Colonel General Beck, Quartermaster General Wagner, General von Tresco, Colonel Baron Freytag von Loringhofen, and others. Count Stauffenberg, Albrecht, Merz von Kornheim, and von Geften fell into the hands of Fromm's court-martial and were shot. Hitler ordered that all the accused be tried by one general court, the People's Tribunal. For the soldiers, this order meant that they were to be tried not by an imperial military court, but by a special court of civilian judges, and that the trial would be guided not by military punishment laws and court enforcement regulations, but by Hitler's special orders dictated by hatred and lust for revenge. Under Hitler's dictatorship, there were no legal rules to counter these orders. In order to bring before a people's tribunal military personnel suspected of collaboration with the conspirators or knowledge of their activities, it was necessary to demobilize them. This was to be done after an investigation, the conduct of which Hitler entrusted to the so-called Court of Honor. This court consisted of Field Marshal von Rundstedt as chairman and Keitel, Schroth, Kriebel, Kirchheim, and myself as members. I asked not to burden me with this little attractive task, citing the fact that I am overburdened with the duties of my new position, while remaining at the same time Inspector General of Armoured Forces. However, my request was left unheeded. I only succeeded in having a permanent deputy, General Kirchheim, assigned to me in case my official duties prevented me from attending the meetings. At first I did not participate in the proceedings at all, but Keitel sought me out and offered to appear on Hitler's behalf. Thus I was nevertheless forced to attend 2 or 3 terrible sessions. What I heard there was very sad and startling. The preliminary investigation was conducted by Kaltenbrunner and SS Gruppenführer Müller of the Gestapo. The former was an Austrian lawyer, the latter a Bavarian official. Both of them had no concept of the honor of the officer corps. It can be said of Müller that his attitude toward the officers was a mixture of hatred and other low feelings. It was a cold and vain nature. In addition to these persons, General Bergdorf, chief of the Army Personnel Department, and his first assistant, General Meisel, took part in the meetings. They were responsible for keeping the minutes and were Hitler's observers. The materials of the preliminary investigation contained the handwritten statements of the accused, for the most part confessions made with the almost unimaginable frankness with which officers usually spoke before an officers' court of honor composed of men of the same profession. The fact that the accused had been in the Gestapo and had to deal with interrogators who thought quite differently obviously did not reach the consciousness of these unfortunates. Therefore, the testimony contained not only what concerned the accused directly, it also included the names, actions, or mistakes of others. Everyone whose name was mentioned in these depositions was then arrested and interrogated. Thus the Gestapo soon had before it an almost complete picture of the conspiracy, knew its scope and the circle of its participants. And not only that, with the frank confession of the accused, it was often simply impossible to declare him innocent and uninvolved in the conspiracy. Although I was seldom present at the meetings, I endeavored in every possible way to save people whenever possible. Unfortunately, few people succeeded in doing good service. The other members of the court, especially Kirchheim, Schroth and Kriebel, acted in the same spirit. Supported us always and Field Marshal von Rundstedt. Court of Honor after the preliminary investigation had only to decide which of the accused, for complicity or for knowledge, would or would not be tried by the People's Tribunal. If it was decided to hand over the accused to the tribunal, then the relevant military department made a proposal for the demobilization of the accused from the Wehrmacht. In this case, the competence of the Imperial Military Court was no longer valid. Such a decision could only be made on the basis of available documents. Interrogations of the accused were not allowed. In conducting this unseemly trial, one had to come into severe conflict with one's conscience. One had to think over every word one did not want, by mitigating the guilt of one, to plunge into misfortune other people, still unknown or already arrested. The death sentences of the People's Tribunal were carried out by hanging, a method of punishment hitherto unknown to German justice, even military justice. Prior to this, soldiers who were sentenced to death were shot. The death penalty by hanging was brought to us from Austria. Unfortunately, it is still practiced today. Whoever is preparing to carry out a coup d'état takes into account that in case of failure he will be accused of treason and will pay with his life. But who of those executed for their participation in the plot of July 20th, 1944 thought about this? Probably very few. In any case, this argument was not recognized by Hitler, and so it turned out that officers were convicted who only learned on the eve of July 20th that a coup d'état was being prepared and could not immediately report it to the proper authorities because they did not immediately realize the importance of the message they had heard. Completely uninvolved persons were drawn into a ruinous cycle because they were trying to help their comrades. The most startling example of such uninvolvement is the case which occurred to General Geistermann von Silberg, son-in-law of my esteemed former inspector and division commander, General Chiswitz. Silberg was commanding a division on the Eastern Front on July 20th. His chief of staff, Major Kuhn, who had previously worked for General Stieff in the organizational department of the Army General Staff, was aware of the impending plot. Silberg received a telegram ordering him to immediately arrest Kuhn and send him under secure escort to Berlin. Silberg authorized Kuhn to move forward alone to the new command post. By this he wanted to give him the opportunity to commit suicide. But Kuhn did not seize the opportunity to shoot himself, as Silberg had intended, but defected to the enemy. Silberg was arrested and tried in a court-martial. The court gave a very lenient judgment. Hitler soon learned of this. He ordered a new investigation in order to give Silberg a death sentence, because Kuhn, who had once served in the organizational department of the General Staff of the Army, was undoubtedly privy to many secret matters, so that his defection to the enemy could cause significant damage to our front. In February 1945, Silberg was shot. The same fate befell the son-in-law of my unfortunate chief, the good-hearted General Gotchi, though for a different reason General Gotchi's son-in-law expressed the opinion that this war could not be won. Sad was the fate of the condemned, but even sadder was the fate of their relatives. The police arrests that fell upon them brought incredible agony and mental torture. Only some of them could be helped and their suffering alleviated. The outcome of the assassination attempt is appalling if we consider the state of affairs as it is. I myself am an opponent of all murder. Our Christian religion gives a clear commandment in this respect. Therefore, I cannot approve of assassination attempts. Regardless of this religious reason, I must also state that for a successful outcome, the coup d'état at that time had neither internal nor external political prerequisites. The preparations were completely insufficient. The selection of persons for the most important government posts was incomprehensible. The organizer of the conspiracy was at first Dr. Goadella, an idealist who thought to carry out a coup d'état without attempts. He and his conspirators were undoubtedly inspired by the idea of doing their people the kindest service possible. Dr. Godella selected a large number of prominent figures for the government and prepared lists which, through his own carelessness, fell into the hands of the Gestapo. I have already given the characterization of Colonel General Beck, who was to be made head of state. His behavior on July 20th confirmed the correctness of my opinion. Field Marshal von Witzleben was a sick man. True, he hated Hitler terribly, but he hardly had the determination needed to commit a military putsch in such a tense situation. Colonel General Gopner was a brave frontline soldier, but I doubt that he fully realized the importance of his actions on July 20th. General Albrecht was a very capable officer, well aware of his duties, but he had neither command authority nor troops on which he could rely for a coup d'état. Up to July 20th, 1944, i.e., for several years there were discussions and meetings. The circle of people who were aware of the plans of the conspirators was constantly expanding. Not surprisingly, the Gestapo eventually got wind of one of the conspirators' circles. The threat of a wave of arrests was looming. Apparently, this prompted the impulsive Count Stauffenberg, without further delay, to make an assassination attempt, the meaning of which was hardly understood by the other conspirators. The attempt failed. The assassin was greatly mistaken as to the efficacy of his bomb and behaved very rashly. The actions of Colonel General Fromm, commander of the Reserve Army, were incomprehensible. In the end, he himself was also the victim of an unfortunate assassination attempt. General Heinrich von Stolpnagel, commander of the troops in France, a great idealist, whom I knew well and every time I came to Paris to visit, was to die a terrible death. But the most terrible was the death of Field Marshal Rommel, the truth of which I learned when I was already a prisoner. Only then did I realize the depth of the tragedy we had experienced. Of course, many times the question will be raised what would have happened if the assassination attempt had succeeded. No one can say. One thing seems certain: at that time a large part of the German people still believed in Adolf Hitler, and would therefore have decided that the conspirators had eliminated the one man who might have prevented a complete military catastrophe. The hatred of the people would have fallen primarily on the officer corps, the generals and the general staff, and not only during the war, but also afterward. The hatred and contempt of the people would be transferred to the soldiers who, in the midst of a deadly battle with the enemy, violate their oath of office and kill the head of state, leaving the endangered ship of state without a captain. It cannot be doubted that our adversaries would have treated us better, had the assassination attempt succeeded, than they are treating us now, after our defeat. But here it may be asked what would have happened, after all. I would like to say only one thing. A lot is written and talked about resistance to Hitler's regime. But who of the survivors, current speakers and writers, who once had access to Hitler, even once tried to resist him? Who dared even once to oppose Hitler, to voice his opinion and insist on it face to face with the dictator? That is exactly what should have been done. During the months when I went to see Hitler for a report and had numerous conversations with him on military, technical and political subjects, I saw that few people did so, of whom, unfortunately, only a few are now alive. I absolutely refuse to call as resistance fighters such people who only murmured behind the scenes that they held a different opinion, people who only tried to incite others to active action. Anyone who held a different opinion from Hitler was obliged to tell him so quite openly if he had the opportunity. This had to be done in the first place when it was absolutely necessary, when it still made sense, namely, in the years before the war. Whoever clearly realized that Hitler's policy must lead to war. That war must be prevented. That war would be a misfortune for our people, should have sought and found occasion before the war to say this to Hitler and the German people with all clarity, if not in Germany itself, then from abroad. Did the conspirators do this in due course? I have seen German soldiers in two difficult wars. In World War II, I had the honor of being their commander. In battle, they were loyal to the death, faithful to their oaths despite threatening disaster. That's the way they should remain. Only this devotion, this selflessness, this indescribable heroism will help to revive a strong and healthy nation, a strong and healthy state. God grant that the younger generation may succeed in rebuilding a new Germany on this noble basis in a peaceful way, a Germany that will be respected by other nations again, as it once was. Let us return to the military events taking place at that time. After the General Staff of the Land Forces General Command had been made operational, it was found that it was acting with extreme slowness. This was due to the fact that Hitler retained the right to approve all minor matters and was unwilling to give the Chief of General Staff the most minimal authority to issue orders. It was not until October 2nd, 1944, that the uprising was crushed. Given that the rebels were inclined to capitulate, I advised Hitler to adhere to the principles of international law and treat them as prisoners of war, in order to end the senseless slaughter sooner. Hitler agreed to this suggestion as well. Colonel General Reinhardt, who became on August 15th, instead of Model Commander of Army Group Center, received a corresponding directive. According to this directive, the troops acted. In the fight against insurgents, it is always difficult to distinguish between the organized fighters from the civilian population. General Komorowski himself wrote about it in the battles. Our commanders could hardly distinguish soldiers from civilians. Our men did not wear military uniforms, and we could not prevent the civilian population from wearing white and red armbands on their hands. The civilians, like the soldiers of the National Army, used trophy weapons, which prevented them from being careful with ammunition. For one German soldier, the insurgent civilians expended several shells and hand grenades. Every report I received contained complaints about the aimless waste of ammunition. Since the Poles, moreover, wore German military uniforms taken from the warehouses captured from us, the complexity of the German situation, and thus their tendency to mercilessly destroy the enemy, increased more and more. Therefore, it is not surprising that Hitler, to whom Fegelein and Himmler regularly reported on the events in Warsaw, often burst into anger, giving strict orders concerning the tactics of combat operations and the treatment of the inhabitants of Warsaw. This anger found expression in an instruction from the High Commissar of the SSS and Eastern Zone Police to the Governor-General of Krakow, Dr. Frank, dated October 11th, 1944, new policy toward Poland. Obergruppenführer von dem Bach has received orders to pacify Warsaw, i.e., even before the end of the war, to raise Warsaw to the ground, since this will not interfere with the fulfillment of military plans for the construction of fortifications. Before the destruction begins, all raw materials, textiles and furniture must be removed from Warsaw. This is the main task of the civil administration. I knew nothing about this order, which was issued along SS lines at that time. I first read it in 1946 in a Nuremberg prison. Rumors of the intention to completely destroy Warsaw, which was circulating in the main headquarters, as well as the outburst of Hitler's anger in my presence in connection with the events in Warsaw, prompted me to point out in a regular report on the need to preserve the city, declared by Hitler's order a fortress in which German troops should take refuge. It was all the more important to preserve the buildings, because the Vistula at that time had already become the front line that ran through the city. During the repeated uprisings in 1943 to 1944, Warsaw was already badly destroyed, and as a result of the fighting from the fall of 1944 until the beginning of the Russian offensive in January 1945, the surviving buildings of this unfortunate city were destroyed. After the surrender, the captured rebels were handed over to the SS. Komorowski was an acquaintance of Fegelein. They met many times at international tournaments. Fegelein took care of him. July 25th, 1944, an attempt by the 16th Tank Corps of the Russians to cross the Vistula on the railroad bridge near Demblin failed. The enemy losses amounted to 30 tanks. The bridge was blown up in time. Other parts of the Russian armoured forces were held north of Warsaw. We, the Germans, at that time gave the impression that our defence forced the enemy to suspend the offensive. On August 2nd, the First Polish Army of the Polish Free Democratic Armed Forces went on the offensive with 3 divisions across the Vistula at Puloj, Dęblin. Despite heavy losses, it still managed to capture one bridge fortification and hold it until Soviet reinforcements arrived. Near Magnusiu on the Vistula, the enemy also managed to create a pre-bridge fortification. The troops that forced the Vistula in this area had the task of advancing along the coast to Warsaw, but were stopped at the Pilica River. Nevertheless, on August 8th, the command of the German Ninth Army gave the impression that the Russian attempt to capture Warsaw by a sudden attack from the move broke the resilience of the German defences, despite the uprising of the Poles, which, from the enemy's point of view, began prematurely. The Army headquarters reported that for the period from July 26 to August 8, 1,944 captured 603 prisoners of war. There are 41 defectors. During this period, the Army units hit 337 tanks and took the following trophies: 70 guns, 80 anti-tank guns, 27 mortars, and 100. These were impressive figures after a month of continuous retreating fighting. So far, both in the east and in the west, no defensive fortifications had been built. Hitler believed that in the west could rely on the Atlantic rampart, and with regard to the east stated that if fortifications were built, the generals would be less energetic in defending their areas, and would be prone to premature withdrawal to rear defensive lines. Now, however, after the setbacks which had deprived us of nearly all the territories we had captured in the east, after the Eastern Front had advanced threateningly close to the German frontiers, something had to be done under all conditions, lest some small setback should at once affect the general situation. According to my conviction, which I reported to Hitler back in January, it was necessary first of all to rebuild our old fortified areas in the east. Then the defensive lines between these fortified areas and the most important power lines had to be restored. I drew up with Jacob, Inspector General of Engineers at the Army High Command, a plan for the construction work. To develop plans for the construction of fortifications, I ordered the reinstatement of the Fortifications Department of the General Staff, dissolved by my predecessor, and appointed Lieutenant Colonel Thilo as head of this department. I sent the plan we had worked out under my personal responsibility as an order to the appropriate authorities, and then presented it to Hitler, reporting that because of the extreme importance and urgency of the matter, I must ask for approval of the plan retroactively. Hitler reluctantly agreed to do so. I could not resort to such a method often. At any rate, the construction of fortifications began. Earthworks were carried out, as a rule, by volunteers, women, children and the elderly. It involved all the labour force, which could still allocate our country. The organisation Hitler Youth gave us great help. All these courageous Germans, despite the bad weather, worked with great diligence and a sense of duty in the hope of creating at least some cover for their dearly beloved homeland, to provide defensive lines for soldiers engaged in heavy fighting. It is true that later their labour did not justify all the hopes that they and I had placed on it. However, this cannot be blamed on the men who built the fortifications, nor can it be attributed to the fallacy of the principle itself. The fortifications were not provided with garrisons and armaments because the Western Front, by unavoidable necessity, demanded and received everything that had been procured for the Eastern Front, and the latter received only a miserable remnant which could not be used in the West. It is appropriate here to express heartfelt gratitude to the men who built the fortifications for their selfless and conscientious help. Moreover, many of the defences they built have served their purpose for a long time. We hope that the time will come when the defences of Königsberg, Danzig, Głogów and Breslau will be studied with impartiality. No one can say at what pace the Russian offensive would have proceeded, or what other German territories would have been struck by their baneful influence, if the German defences had not been built. It was quite clear to me that the fortifications to be built could withstand a siege only if they were supplied with garrisons, arms and miscellaneous supplies. I therefore ordered the formation of fortress units from conscripts who were found not fully fit for fighting in the field, but who, with proper organisation of food and medical care, could serve in the fortified areas. 100 such fortress infantry battalions and 100 batteries were formed at first. They were to be followed by machine gun, anti-tank, tank and communications units. But we had not yet had time to properly train these first units before 80% of them were sent to the Western Front. My strong protests were not heeded. I found out too late and could not change anything. In the West, these as yet untrained units were caught in a maelstrom of defeat and died without doing any good. In the East, the excellent defensive positions and fortifications were unoccupied and subsequently failed to become real strongholds for the troops withdrawing from the front. The same thing happened with armaments. My first proposal to put at my disposal warehouses of captured guns was almost mockingly rejected by Keitel and Adolf. They believed that there were no more unused trophy guns in Germany. However, the Chief of Operations of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, General Boulait, reported that there were still many artillery pieces and other heavy weapons in the warehouses. All this equipment has been greased a little at a time for several years, but has not been used. I ordered to install these guns on the eastern fortifications and the most important defensive positions and to prepare calculations for them. But Adolf achieved the transfer to the Western Front all guns of caliber greater than 50 ms, well as guns from which more than 50 shots were fired. But these guns arrived too late on the Western Front, while they could still be of invaluable help to the Eastern Front. The 50mm and 37mm anti-tank guns in 1941 were no longer effective against Russian T-30-44 tanks, and so it was in the East that larger caliber guns were needed. As for supplies, the order was given to provide the fortifications with everything they needed for 3 months. Radios were set up, fuel supplies were established. I used every trip I made to monitor the progress of the work on the ground. I was supported in my endeavours by my friends, especially Colonel General Strauss. They again placed themselves at my disposal, despite their former positions, from which they were forced out by illness or Hitler's unappealing decision. Some of the Gauleiters also assisted energetically, and if sometimes friction arose as a result of their overzealousness, their goodwill and willingness to help us must be recognized. The German command and German troops did not expect such treachery. Although Hitler immediately authorized the withdrawal of the army group, in some areas our troops tried to hold the front and slowly, with fighting retreated. To avoid complete defeat and destruction, it was necessary to retreat quickly and hold the bridges on the Danube. But this was not done. As a result, the Romanians were ahead of the Germans, blocked the crossings and thus gave the German units in the hands of the Russians. We completely lost 16 German divisions, irreparable losses in our already difficult situation. These German units fought courageously to the end. Their battle honor remained untarnished. They are not guilty of their hard fate. This misfortune could have been mitigated if it had been decided to withdraw to the line of Galatz, Fuchseni, Carpathians even before the beginning of the Russian offensive, and thus disrupt the plans of the Russians, shortening the front so much that it could be held without the Romanians. But this required a clear understanding of the political situation and the moral qualities of the head of the Romanian state. Antonescu was badly mistaken in this and had to pay with death for his mistake. His assurance about the reliability of the Romanian generals and officers was unfortunately unfounded, but it made a well-known impression on the German command and also misled it. Within a few weeks, the whole of Romania was lost. On September 1st, the Russians entered Bucharest. Bulgaria, whose king died on August 28, 1943 under rather strange circumstances, fell out of our coalition and went over to the enemy's side on September 8th. We lost 88 of our TIV tanks and 50 assault guns, which we had at one time sent to Bulgaria. Hitler's hopes of getting at least 2 Bulgarian anti-Bolshevik divisions collapsed. The German soldiers in Bulgaria were disarmed and taken prisoner. The Bulgarians defected to the Russian side and began to fight against us. Now it became clear to Hitler that there was no point in defending the Balkans. The need for a gradual containment evacuation was recognized. However, the withdrawal of troops was too slow and did not allow to release the forces necessary for the defence of Germany. On September 19, 1944, Finland concluded an armistice with Britain and Russia. The consequence of this step was a break in relations with Germany. Field Marshal Keitel's visit to Field Marshal Mannerheim on August 20, 1944, was fruitless. Already on September 3 the Finns requested an armistice. Not surprisingly, after these events, Allied loyalty to Hungary was also shaken. Regent Admiral von Horthy had followed Hitler even before, not because of his convictions, but only in obedience to political necessity. This restrained, wait-and-see attitude was already evident during Horthy's visit to Berlin in 1938. During the war, Hitler repeatedly had to exert strong pressure on Horthy to force him to act in a direction favourable to Germany. And so, at the end of August 1944, Hitler sent me to Budapest to deliver a letter to the regent and also to get an idea of his position. I was received at the castle in Budapest courteously and with all due honours. The regent's first words after we sat down at the table were, "You see, honoured colleague, in politics one must always have an escape route." I understood the meaning of his words. A smart, experienced politician, he always had a back exit, or thought at least that he had one. Admiral Horthy spoke for a long time in a very polite way about the national problem in Hungary, a country in which different nationalities have had to coexist for several centuries. He emphasized the close ties which had long connected Hungary with friendly Poland, to which Hitler, in his opinion, paid very little attention. He asked that the Hungarian cavalry division fighting in the Warsaw area be withdrawn from Poland as soon as possible. I could promise him this, as we ourselves intended to send the Hungarians fighting in Poland back home. I could not have a positive impression of Horthy's position, which I was forced to report to Hitler. All the beautiful words of the Hungarian Chief of General Staff, Ferenc, could not change my opinion. At the end of August, the Russians approached Bucharest and broke into its suburbs. War was knocking on Hungary's door. In Budapest, I lived under the impression of these events. In these difficult days for the Eastern Front on the Western Front were also bloody defensive battles. July 17th, Field Marshal Rommel was the victim of an attack by British fighter bombers. Field Marshal von Kluge had to take the overall leadership of operations. On this day, the front line in the west ran from the mouth of the Orne River, along the southern outskirts of Caen, through Carmont-Saint, Lessay to the coast. On July 30th, the Americans broke through our front at Avranches. A few weeks later, on August 15th, the main forces of the German army on the Western Front were fighting for their existence. 2/3 of these forces were threatened with encirclement at Falaise. Armoured and motorised formations of the enemy were advancing on Orléans and through Chartres to Paris. Normandy and Brittany, except for a few forts of the Atlantic ramparts with 5 German divisions surrounded in them, were lost. The Americans landed in small forces on the Mediterranean coast between Toulon and Cannes. The 11th Panzer Division, which could have resisted them, was unfortunately on the west bank of the Rhône, near Narbonne. Other German divisions were 2.5 divisions in Holland, 7 divisions on the front running along the straight coast between the Scheldt and the Seine, 1 division on the Channel Islands, 2 divisions on the coast, between the Loire and the Pyrenees, 7.5 divisions on the Mediterranean coast, and 1 division on the Alpine front, on the Italian border. To repel the enemy's offensive on Paris, we could allocate only 2.5 divisions. Of the fresh forces, 2 SS divisions were sent to Belgium, 3 infantry divisions moved through Cologne and Koblenz in France. Here now the headquarters of operational leadership of the armed forces remembered the importance of rear positions. On the operational maps of the situation were drawn defensive lines on the rivers Seine, Somme and Marne. But these lines remained marked only on maps. Now even Hitler decided to replace Field Marshal von Kluge Field Marshal Model, and further limit the scope of Model's competence to the main front of the invasion, the overall leadership of the troops in the west again entrusted to Field Marshal von Rundstedt. The day of August 15th, 1944 was a stormy day in the Führer's headquarters. On the basis of reports from the Western Theatre of Operations, I made a report on the situation of the tank formations. I stated to Hitler the bravery of the armoured forces alone cannot compensate for the absence of the other two components of the armed forces, aviation and navy. Hitler became furious. He demanded that I follow him into the next room. There we began to argue so loudly that one of Hitler's adjutants, Major von Olsberg, entered the room and said, "Gentlemen, you are talking so loudly that you can hear every word outside. Will you permit me to close the windows?" Hitler became desperate when he learned that Field Marshal von Kluge had not returned from his trip to the front. He assumed that the Field Marshal had established communication with the enemy. Therefore, he ordered to summon him to report to the Führer's main headquarters. But Field Marshal von Kluge committed suicide by poisoning himself on the way. August 25th, 1944, Paris fell. Hitler and the headquarters of operational leadership of the armed forces had to make a final decision on the further development of operations. It had to be clear to themselves which area was of greatest importance to the German fortress defense. Hitler and his military advisors had no doubt that the defense should be continued. Any thought of negotiations with the opponents was henceforth meaningless because of the demand for unconditional surrender, which jointly put up our adversaries. However, the desire to strictly confine ourselves to one defense could only continue our resistance, but could hardly lead to a favorable outcome of the war. Transferring the main burden of defense to the east would have strengthened the Eastern Front and would have halted the further advance of the Russians. The militarily and food-important areas of Upper Silesia and Poland would have remained for Germany. But making this decision required leaving the Western Front to itself, which in the near future would have led to its fall under the blows of superior forces of the Western powers. Hitler could not count on the inclination of the Western powers to make a separate peace to the detriment of Russian interests, so he rejected this decision. On the contrary, the transfer of the main efforts to the West, in Hitler's opinion, created in the view of Hitler, with the timely introduction into the battle of the available forces and means of the prospect of a powerful blow to the Western Allies, before they come to the Rhine River, or forcing it. This decision required compliance with the following preconditions: strengthening the Eastern Front and holding it until an offensive with limited purpose in the West was over and until it was possible to transfer the freed forces to the East. Carrying out this offensive as soon as possible in order to free up reserves for the Eastern Front before the onset of winter. Immediate concentration of forces for the offensive in order to create practical conditions for the implementation of the decision taken. Waging a successful struggle to buy time on the Western Front before the offensive begins. Hitler and the General Staff of the Armed Forces planned to begin offensive operations as early as mid-November in order to create the opportunity to move strong reserves to the east by mid-December. The forecast for a warm fall with the late onset of cold weather in the east allowed to expect that the winter offensive of the Russians will begin after the new year. Given these prerequisites, the command decided that my concerns about the Eastern Front should be disregarded. It is clear that I, as one of the leaders of the Eastern Front, was very concerned about such a plan for the further development of operations. After the decision had been made regarding the Western Front, I saw my task in fulfilling the first condition of the plan to strengthen the Eastern Front. In addition to the already mentioned work on the creation of rear defensive lines and fortifications, the front also began to equip positions by all means. All tank and motorized divisions were removed from the front until December, divided into 4 groups as mobile reserves and replenished with fresh forces. However, the shortage of infantry on the Eastern Front allowed only one single infantry division to be withdrawn and concentrated as a reserve in the Krakow area. The pre-bridge fortifications on the Vistula, captured by the Russians during the summer fighting, had to be eliminated or at least reduced in order to delay the beginning of the enemy's offensive or hamper his actions. Finally, in order to reduce the front line and create reserves, it was necessary to evacuate by sea German troops from the Baltic, as the attempt to withdraw these troops by land failed. Unfortunately, all points of this plan of action on the Eastern Front we were not able to realize. It is true that the construction of fortifications was successful, but the garrisons and armament intended for them, due to the catastrophically rapid change of the situation in the West, had to be sent to the invasion front. Hence, the importance of the fortifications was limited. It was further reduced after Hitler ordered the creation of the so-called main line of resistance, which was to be occupied directly by the invasion front, which was to be occupied just before a major enemy offensive. According to Hitler's order, it was created not at a distance of 20 km from the front line of defense, but at a distance of only 2 to 4 kilometers. On the Vistula River, it was possible to eliminate one Russian pre-bridge fortification and reduce the others. Due to the fact that a number of divisions were withdrawn from the Eastern Front, and the commander of the 4th Panzer Army, the indefatigable General Balck, was transferred to the Western Front on this crucial section, unfortunately could not achieve greater success. The pre-bridge fortifications, especially at Baranau, remained dangerous hotbeds for us. Especially adversely affected the failure to fulfill the plan to reduce the front line, as Army Group North continued to defend in the Baltic. Hitler rejected my repeated proposal to evacuate the Baltics and create strong reserves from Army Group North. In doing so, he was guided by political motives and the uncertainty of the Commander-in-Chief of Naval Forces, Grand Admiral Dönitz. Hitler feared that the evacuation of our troops will have an unfavorable impact on the neutral position of Sweden and damage the training area for submarines in the Danzig Bay. In addition, he thought that by holding the Baltics to restrain a sufficiently large number of Russian divisions in the north of the Eastern Front, which otherwise the enemy could use in more dangerous for us sections of the Eastern Front. The incessant Russian attacks in the Baltic strengthened this opinion of his. On the basis of these and other similar arguments, Hitler and the headquarters of the operational leadership of the armed forces also rejected all proposals for the immediate evacuation of German troops from the Balkans and Norway, as well as the reduction of the front line in Italy. But not only the plan of action on the Eastern Front was unfulfilled. Even more deplorable was the situation on the Western Front. Neglect of the Western fortifications, including the Western Shaft, and the concentration of all engineering forces and means, since 1940, exclusively on the Atlantic Shaft retaliated now in the most serious way. From the east were removed all the meagre, at best third-rate forces created on the initiative of the Eastern Front Command as early as the fall of 1944. But even these reinforcements were not enough, and the German front in France collapsed, so the unoccupied fortifications were of no importance. Their rapid fall forced maneuver warfare in the operational expanse with almost immobile formations, as the road network was destroyed by the air-dominated enemy aircraft. When armoured formations were available, Normandy was a positional war. Now that the armoured forces were used up, had to conduct maneuver warfare, which had previously been abandoned. Favourable opportunities that presented themselves sometimes due to too bold actions of the American command could not be used. The original plan to attack on the southern flank of the Americans had to be abandoned. However, the worst was that the date of the offensive, i.e. mid-November, was unrealistic and had to move it to mid-December. This worsened the prospects for the timely release and transfer of reserves to the east, and in general to hold the weakened Eastern Front. It was not possible to deploy forces for the offensive in the west in time. The struggle to gain time on the Western Front was unsuccessful. But, despite the unfavourable conditions, Hitler and the high command of the armed forces stubbornly held on to the decision once taken by them to attack in the west. They kept their plans secret. The enemy was taken by surprise. However, keeping the offensive plans secret from their own staffs and troops was taken to such an extreme that it affected the supply of the advancing troops with everything necessary, especially fuel. While the Western Front was pushed back from the Atlantic rampart to the Western rampart, heavy fighting was going on continuously on the Eastern Front. On the southern section of this front, it was not possible to halt the advance of the Russians. As a result of their offensive, held with small pauses, was captured the entire territory of Romania, Bulgaria, and, finally, most of Hungary. In Hungary fought Army Group Southern Ukraine. Under the command of Colonel General Friesner, which on September 25th changed its inaccurate name Southern Ukraine to South. In October, after persistent fighting in the area of Debrecen, where the counterattacks of our troops temporarily stopped the enemy, the Siebenbergen area was completely captured by the Russians. In the area of operations of Army Group Southeast under the command of Field Marshal Baron von Weix in this month fell Belgrade. Despite the fact that the Balkan Front had in fact already merged with the Eastern Front, the leadership of which was carried out by the General Command of Land Forces, this group continued to remain under the jurisdiction of the General Command of the Armed Forces. The boundary between the spheres of the Armed Forces Command and the Land Forces General Command was between the mouths of the Drava and Baja rivers. It made no sense at all. South of this boundary, on the northern flank of Group Southeast, the Russians were forcing the Danube, while the group commander was focusing his attention on the weak section of his troops front located much further south. On October 29th, the Russians came close to Budapest, and on November 24th they forced the Danube at Mohacs. At this time, while German troops were still standing at Salonika and Durazzo, the Moravian Valley was already in enemy hands. Because of the guerrilla warfare in the Balkans, clearing them became increasingly difficult. On November 30th, the Russians broke through the front of the group southeast near the town of Pec, north of the Drava River, came to Lake Balaton and attacked the Danube section, defended by Army Group South. Until December 5th, they managed to get close to Budapest from the south. On the same day, they forced the river north of Budapest, advanced to the city of Vac, and with difficulty were stopped by us east of the River Gron. Further to the northeast, they captured Miskolc and reached the area south of Kazoo. Our troops in the Balkans withdrew to the line of Podgorica, Uzis, and further north. The offensive, launched on December 21st, led on Christmas Day 1944 to the encirclement of Budapest. The enemy reached the line of Lake Balaton, Stolvansenberg west of Komano, and north of the Danube to the River Gron. From there, the front line ran almost along the Hungarian state border. On both sides, the fighting was fierce. We suffered heavy losses. At the front of Army Group Northern Ukraine, Colonel General Harp, which since September was called Army Group A, the Russians, continuing the offensive, in late July, reached the Vistula River, coming close to Warsaw. South of her fierce fighting between the San and Vistula rivers, Army Group consisted at this time of the 1st Panzer Army of Colonel General Heinrizi, which was in the Carpathians, the 17th Army of General Schultz in the area between the Carpathians and the Vistula, and the 4th Panzer Army of General Balk, which stood on the Vistula. By August 1st, the Russians had captured a number of pre-bridge fortifications beyond the Vistula, the most important of which was the fortification at Barano, smaller ones at Pulawa, at Magnusiu, and a fourth in another area. The Russian successes in the mountains were, of course, smaller. Especially critical was the situation on August 5th to 9th at the pre-bridge fortification near Barano. Here the Russians could at any day realize a breakthrough. Only thanks to the tireless energy and skillful leadership of General Balk managed to prevent disaster in this area. By fierce counterattacks, which lasted for weeks, Balk managed to significantly narrow the large pre-bridge fortification at Baranuva, eliminate another small pre-bridge fortification and fortify at Pulava. After that, the Russians shifted the main blow of their offensive to the mountains. At Sanok and Jaslo they managed to cut into our defences, but failed to make a decisive breakthrough. The mountain ridge of the eastern Beskids was held until the events in Hungary forced to turn the 1st Tank Army to the line of Kazoo, Jaslo. By the new year, the front line of this army group ran along the Slovakian border to the area east of Kazoo, thence through Jaslo, west of Dembitz, west of Stazo, south of Opito, along the Vistula River north of the mouth of the San River, to Warsaw. Army Group Center included the 9th Army of General von Foreman, 2nd Army of Colonel General Weiss, 4th Army of General Gosbach and 3rd Panzer Army of Colonel General Reinhardt, which from August 15th was commanded by Colonel General Rouse. This group of armies was commanded by Field Marshal Model, and after his transfer on August 15th to the Western Front, Colonel General Reinhardt. In August, the enemy came close to Warsaw, then reached the line Ostrov, Sudowan, East Prussian border, west of Siolii, west of Siolii, west of Mitava. In September, he advanced northeast of Warsaw to the Neary River, on which in October he created pre-bridge fortifications on both sides of Ostenburg. During the period from October 5th to October 19th, the already mentioned breakthrough of the German front west of Siolii was made. Army Groups Center and North were finally cut off from each other. Army Group Center turned its left flank to Memel on October 19th, leaving on October 22nd held on the north bank of the river pre-bridge fortifications at Tilsit and Ragnit. From October 16th to 26th, the Russians were advancing in East Prussia on the front of Gumbinnen, Goldap. In heavy fighting they were stopped, and in some places slightly thrown back. The events that took place here allowed the German people to get an idea of what threatened him in the event of a Russian victory. Army Group North, as already indicated, in the period from 14 to 26 September, was withdrawn to the pre-bridge fortification in the area of Riga in order to quickly further its transfer to Army Group Center. This plan failed because of a contradictory decision of the commander of the army group, Colonel General Schorner. The latter delayed his armoured forces in the area of Riga, Mitava, instead of withdrawing them to the area west of Siolii, and thus gave the enemy the opportunity to make a breakthrough near the city of Siolii, which finally cut off the army group from the main group of troops. Army group consisted of the 16th and 18th armies. In this area we had at first 26 divisions, and then after repeated evacuations remained 16, which are so badly lacking for the defence of the Reich. After the abandonment of Riga from October 7th to 16, the front line of the army group ran from the coast south of Libava through Prekul, south of Frauenburg, east of Tukum, and to the coast of the Gulf of Riga. The relative stability of the heavily stretched front between the Carpathians and the Baltic Sea made it possible to strengthen it and allocate tank and motorized divisions to the mobile reserve. Of course, 12 weak divisions represented a very insignificant reserve for a gigantic front of 1,200 kilometers, and in view of the great superiority the Russians now possessed. The construction of fortifications on the Eastern Front was reduced, meanwhile, to the creation of stretched positions occupied by small forces, strong enough for positional action, but unable to withstand a strong enemy attack. We made every effort to use the experience of the last battles, while encountering resistance from Hitler. One of the most important requirements of the front was the establishment of a second defense strip behind the first defense strip, which was created in normal combat conditions, and on which we could rely in major defensive battles. The front commanders demanded that about 20 km to the rear of the front edge of the first defense strip strong, carefully camouflaged and occupied positions should be erected for major battles. Further, they wished to receive defensive instructions which would give them the right, just before the beginning of the enemy's artillery preparation, to withdraw with their main forces to the second line of defense, leaving only a small cover on the first. Such a maneuver would have made the artillery preparation of it completely in vain, would have nullified all the prolonged preparations of the enemy to deploy his forces, would have forced him to run into a well-prepared defensive line and retreat. There is no doubt that this demand was quite reasonable. I studied it and reported to Hitler. He lost his temper and absolutely refused to put up with this situation, when without a fight wanted to leave a territory 20 km deep. Hitler ordered to create the main line of resistance in 2 to 4 km from the front edge of the defense. When giving this senseless order, he fully lived memories of the First World War, and no arguments could not force him to abandon his decision. This mistake made itself felt very strongly when, in January 1945, the Russians managed to make a breakthrough, and the reserves, again in accordance with Hitler's categorical order and against my advice, were pulled close to the front line. The front edge of the defense, the main line of resistance, and the reserves all at once came under the Russian blows and were simultaneously overturned. Hitler's anger turned now on the people who built the fortifications, and when I began to oppose him, also on me. He ordered to bring the transcript of the meeting held in the fall of 1944, which discussed the position of the main line of resistance, because he now began to claim that he had always stood for a distance of 20 km. What kind of fool would order such nonsense? I drew his attention to the fact that he had done it himself. They brought it in and began to read out the transcript. But after a few sentences he ordered the reading stopped. It was a clear self-exposure. Unfortunately, there was no use in it, because the breakthrough of the front was a fait accompli. We will return to Hitler's tactics in describing the major Russian offensive. Hitler still lived in the belief that he was the only really fighting soldier in the main bet, and therefore believed that most of his military advisors are wrong, and right only he. In addition, he suffered from megalomania, which was fueled by the praise of his Parteigenossen, starting with von Ribbentrop and Göring. All of this led to the fact that Hitler considered himself a military commander, and therefore did not tolerate precepts "you have nothing to teach me." I command the German ground forces on the fronts for 5 years. I have accumulated during this time such a practical experience, which the gentleman from the General Staff will never get. I've read Clausewitz and Moltke and Reed Schlieffen's strategic deployment plans. I'm more in the know than you are. This was one of the many remarks he made to me whenever I endeavoured to explain to him the requirements of the present moment. Though we had plenty of our own worries, the Hungarians were also giving us worries by their lack of fighting ability and questionable Allied loyalty. I have already mentioned the position taken by Regent Horthy towards Hitler. Although this position was understandable from the Hungarian point of view, from our German point of view it was unreliable. The Hungarian regent relied on cooperation with the Anglo-Saxon powers. He wanted to establish communication with them by air. Whether he tried to do this, whether the Anglo-Americans were inclined to do so on their part, I do not know. But I do know that a group of higher Hungarian officers went over to the enemy. On October 15th, General Miklos, whom I had met in Berlin as military attaché, and the chief of the Hungarian General Staff, Veres, who shortly before, while staying with me in East Prussia, had given assurances of his Allied loyalty and received from me as a present a motor car, did so. With this car, my own Mercedes, he left for the Russians a few days later. The Hungarians could no longer be relied upon. Hitler overthrew the Horthy regime and replaced the latter with Selassie, a Hungarian fascist, untalented and unenergetic. This happened on October 16, 1944. But it did nothing to improve the situation in Hungary. Modest remnants of mutual trust and sympathy for each other were disappearing. In Slovakia, which had at first fully supported us, the partisans had long been active. The railroads were becoming more and more dangerous. Passenger trains were stopped, passengers were searched, German soldiers, and especially officers, were killed. This forced strict countermeasures. Hatred and murder reigned in Slovakia, which also took place, unfortunately, on an ever-increasing scale in other countries. The major powers waging war against us called for partisan actions, tactics which were contrary to international law. This forced us to defend ourselves, and this defense was then declared by the prosecutors and judges at Nuremberg to be criminal, contrary to international law. Although the Allied powers, on entering German territory, issued more severe punitive orders than those issued by the Germans in their time, and a disarmed and exhausted Germany gave them no occasion to use these orders. To paint a fuller picture, a little Italy should be touched upon. On June 4, 1944, Allied forces entered Rome. Army Group South under Field Marshal Kesselring was defending the Apennines north of Rome, fighting hard against superior enemy forces. This section of the front linked more than 20 divisions. Loyal to Mussolini Italians could not, because of their weak fighting ability, to be considered a reliable force, and therefore were used only for service in the Riviera. Basically, in the rear of the German front was fierce guerrilla warfare with all the Italian brutality. It forced us to take severe countermeasures, because we could not leave to fate the supply of this group of armies and had to maintain communication with it. The military tribunals of the victorious powers, in condemning these facts after the armistice had been concluded, were guided not by any sense of justice, but solely by their own interests.